All right, great. Well, we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you today. If you're in the Twin Cities, you know we're on our third day of rain, so it's a great way to spend your lunch hour since you can't go outside. Um, for those of you that don't know, I'm Shannon Schaff. I'm the Executive Director of CFA Society of Minnesota, and today we're hosting a webinar called Creating Investment Grade Content. Before we get started, I just want to first thank all of our annual sponsors. Our annual sponsors help us to bring content like this to you and all of our events. And so if you're interested in more events that we have going on, please check out our website. We're happy to have anyone in the metro area or not in the metro area to join us. And it's my pleasure to welcome Scott Wentworth, founder and CEO of Wentworth Financial Communications, and he's going to share with us today. Okay, Scott, I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for taking time out of your day. I understand that there's members from not just the Minnesota chapter, but from chapters across the country. So appreciate everyone joining. And a little background about myself. I started my career, well, first of all, I went to get my master's in journalism at Northwestern and then went to work for William Blair, which is an asset management and investment banking company in Chicago. And eventually there I became the head writer in the marketing department and was there for about a little more than a decade and sort of realized that there was a need for more writing and more content. This is as firms were creating more content marketing, thought leadership. And so that gave me the idea to start my firm, which is a marketing agency that specializes in creating content just for financial services companies. And we work with companies across the financial services industry, but asset management is definitely the largest. Probably about 2/3 of our revenue comes from asset managers. And we work with some of the, probably 7 or 8 of the top 20 asset managers, also boutiques as well. We also work with wealth managers, investment banks, private equity firms, accounting firms. And what they hire us to do basically is to come in and create ghostwrite on their behalf or create content or advise on their content strategy and everything from thought leadership to product marketing to strategic messaging and executive communications. So I say all that to kind of set the stage for why we have to think about writing as a process and the things that we've learned along the way that we think can be helpful for people who don't have writing in their job. And I know within the CFA Society, most of you don't come from the marketing departments. I know some of you may, but most of you may not view writing as a sort of a core competency or a core part of your job. But as we know, communicating our ideas, whether to an investment committee or giving a presentation or writing an email or writing a white paper, that's how we convey our expertise and that's how we get our ideas across as investors. So regardless of how core writing is to your job, I think it's essential and it's something that we all can get better at. So hopefully today, some of the tips I can share that we have developed or sort of observed in our careers can be helpful for you and help you take your whatever level of writing you're at and take it to the next level. All right, so with that, we'll dive in. All right. I hear from people when I tell people I'm a writer, I hear often reactions, two types of reactions of why people may resist the idea that they can get better as a writer. Some people tell me like, well, I'm very quantitative minded and I'm a numbers person, not a words person. And so they feel that, writing just doesn't come naturally to me. I'm left-brained and analytical, not right-brained and creative. And so they think there's sort of a ceiling on how good of a writer they can be. And what I say to them is that regardless of what your natural inclination is, and I'm guessing a lot of the people in the CFA or CFA charter holders tend to be more quantitative minded. You don't get to choose whether you're a numbers person or a words person, or we live in a world that is both numbers and words. So you don't get to pick and say, I'm just going to be good at the one that I like to be good at. The world doesn't work that way. Our bosses, our clients, our coworkers don't only want to hear from us in the language that you prefer to talk about. So we have to be good at both of those. So regardless of whether you're very analytical minded and focus on the numbers, being good at explaining those ideas is essential for your job. I also hear the nature over nurture argument, people saying that writing is an innate skill and you're either good at it or you don't, and or you're not. And while it's true that writing is a talent and a skill that people have, like any skill, whether it's dancing or fishing or basketball, whatever natural inclination we have, we can all get 10, 20, 30% better at that. And so the goal is to get as high or close to that ceiling of what your natural talent allows. And so again, wherever you're starting from, there's always ways we can get better and hone that skill. When I frame this conversation, I like to borrow heavily from concepts that you all are very familiar as investors, and thinking about, well, how do we evaluate our return on writing? And we know as investors, very focused on ROI, which we know is kind of the capital gains plus dividends over divided by the investment. And applying that to writing, what we want to do is how do we maximize our return on writing? So a concept we came up with, so what's your ROW? And the numerator of that is the quality and the impact of the writing divided by the time and the energy that you put into it. So some of the things that we'll talk about today, or all the things we'll talk about today, will either identify ways to improve the numerator or the denominator, and hopefully sometimes both. So again, as writers, how can we maximize the ratio of how impactful and how interesting our writing is over the amount of time and energy we have to put into it? And we boiled it down to essentially 6 things that we'll talk about today, 6 ways that you can enhance your return on writing. And the first is the most important. And as investors, we know that asset managers are evaluated on the 4 Ps. It's performance, philosophy, people, and obviously the last one is process. As investors, we have to have a repeatable process. We have to be able to explain that we have a repeatable process for how we evaluate investments, how we look at balance sheets, how we construct portfolios, et cetera. And that's the only way that we can prove to people that we can do this over and over again. And just as a process is important to portfolio construction and security selection, it's equally important to us as writers. So the first main tip I'd give you guys as writers is to develop a process and then trust the process. And it's essential to, as a writer, to have a process and know what that is and lean into that. So how we think about the writing process. A lot of people think that writing is just the exercise of sitting down at the computer, opening up your Word document, and you start typing. Like if you said, like, what is writing? They would say it's some version of that, and it's just sort of one big step. But what we say is that the right way to think about it is divide up that writing into sort of 5 discrete steps that you can sort of divide and conquer and focus your energy on doing each one of those things in the right order and in the right way. So first of all, brainstorming. This is the part of the process where we get our ideas out on paper. I literally like to sit down with a blank sheet of paper, not a computer, not a Word document, but just a blank sheet of paper, and just start writing down themes, ideas, anecdotes. It can be big themes, they can be small specifics, but just get the things that I may want to cover in my article or in my email or in my presentation, and just get them down on paper, out of my head, get them on paper. And at this point, I'm not worried about organization. I'm not worried about, hey, is this good enough to make the final cut? I'm just sort of getting random thoughts out of my head onto paper about this topic. And by doing that, I'll sort of develop kind of word clouds, or they're not very artistic, but you kind of start grouping things together. And I strongly recommend doing this with physical paper and pen or pencil, because I found, and I think this is true for a lot of people, that staring at a computer screen is kind of inherently stifling exercise. And we see the blank screen, we see the cursor flashing. I think there's something tactile or useful about the tactile nature of grabbing a pen and seeing your hand actually create the words. It allows you to go faster, and it just kind of unlocks creativity. So again, brainstorming, that's where we start, get our ideas on paper, out of our heads. And then the next step is research. And this is where we actually do the work to start kind of investigating some of the ideas or themes that we want to put in the paper or in the piece, and see what kind of details and data and supporting facts we can line up to support those. It's really important to do this as a separate step ahead of time, because the opposite of that would be, hey, I know I want to write about kind of credit spreads, and I'm writing a blog post about credit spreads, and then I get into it, and I get to the 3rd paragraph where I kind of make the point, and then I don't know exactly what the latest numbers are. So then I go to Bloomberg, I have to look up those numbers, find out what they are. Maybe they don't totally align with what I was going to say. And then I have to come back into my Word document to start writing again. The simple exercise of coming in and out of writing will not only take a lot of time and make you very inefficient, but it also breaks your train of thought. So what we want to do is we want to gather all the details and the nuggets we want to include. We want to get those at our disposal and find what's valid and what isn't ahead of time before we start writing. And this is a great way to preempt writer's block, because nothing can be more sort of stifling or distracting than having a thought but missing one of the key points that goes into that thought. So you want to get those ahead of time and have them ready to go. There's a quote from Thomas Edison that says, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." I've adapted this quote when it comes to the writing process, and I say that writing is 1% inspiration and 99% organization. What I mean by that is I believe that good writing is essentially the sign or the manifestation of an organized mind, meaning good writers are organized thinkers. I know that kind of doesn't align with the mold of the creative type and the artist as a writer, but really, I think effective writing is just the act of organizing thoughts in a way that makes sense to the writer. And that's why I say, because organization is so important, I say that the outline process is the single most important part of the writing process. And I tell people that as a writer, it is by far the most challenging, the part when I'm sort of working and sweating the most. And it's where we make our money as writers, is in the outline phase. So when you're outlining, you're essentially creating the blueprint for your house. This is where you sit down and you organize your ideas. You make the decision of sort of what goes in and what goes out. And you think about what is the story arc and what are the main points I have to hit and in what order. In the outline, this really helps with developing transitions. So when you think about I'm going from point A to point B, we have to think about, okay, this is going to be abrupt, or I'm taking it in a new story. How can I create a transition that explains how point B relates, or point A relates to point B, or how it contradicts it some way or takes it in a new direction? So when I do my outlines, I spend a lot of energy sort of even writing out what that transition sentence looks like, going from the paragraph one to the next one, and thinking through, okay, what's the reader's reaction going to be as we go make these jumps? And then also outlining is a chance to separate the wheat from the chaff and avoid note dumping. I mentioned that I got my master's in journalism, and there was a term I learned there called note dumping. And that is, as a reporter, you spend all this time interviewing sources, looking up stuff. And so you have this notebook full of great things that you can include. And so the impulse is that you want to sort of get all of those facts and all those details into your story, because you've sort of put in the effort and you want to see those things. You kind of fall in love with your own research. But that's called note dumping. And so really the writer needs to be use a lot of discretion and think about, all right, what's the right amount of information to put in is kind of the least amount necessary to get the point across. You don't want to go beyond that. And so you want to be very sort of strict and rigorous in terms of like figuring out what you leave out is just as important as what you put in. I've heard musicians say it's kind of the notes they don't play that matter the most. And it's the same thing when it comes to writing. So again, the outlining is a great way to be very kind of rigorous in figuring out what do I put in, what goes out. And again, your impulse will probably be to put more detail in than you think than is necessary. So recognize that impulse, fight it, and think, hey, does this absolutely have to be in here? And if not, get rid of it. All right, and again, I like to say that great writers are essentially good outliners. Their good writing is just putting the meat on the bones of a good structure. All right, we're going to take a little detour here and want to see if anyone knows who this character is. I know you're all muted, so I'll give you a second to think about it. But if you're like me in your mid-40s, grew up in the 80s, you probably know that this character's name is Chunk from the movie Goonies. And you might be wondering, like, well, why are we talking about Goonies and Chunk in a presentation about writing? Well, the reason is that, when I think about when I get to the writing process, that's when I want to get really chunky with my time. And what I mean by that is writing isn't something that you can do 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, half hour later. If your schedule is forcing you to kind of come in and out of the writing project, you're going to be very inefficient. You're going to lose your train of thought, and you're not going to be in that state of flow. And the state of flow just means when your brain is sort of locked in and you're firing on all cylinders and you're kind of in the groove writing. And once you get there, you want to stay there. And so you want to do things to manipulate your schedule where you give yourself 2 hours set aside to sit down, heads down, let's work on writing the writing part, putting that meat on the bones. And what I like to do is I like to kind of shape my schedule to where try to have as many meetings as possible in the afternoon, free up mornings to sit down where my brain is still fresh. I'm not tired. I have the ability to focus on kind of get 2 good hours of writing time in each morning. And you probably don't want to go too much beyond that because writing is a very sort of mentally taxing exercise, and it's hard to be sharp and stay sharp longer than 2 hours at a time. So number one, kind of create a big chunk of time for yourself to get in and stay in it. You want to eliminate distractions. Again, to stay in that flow state, we don't want to be constantly checking our email or looking at our phone or having people stop by our office and interrupting us. So what I do is I try to create an environment that reduces as many distractions as possible. Close your email, turn off your phone. Those are the kind of the obvious ones. But I even like to go to get out of my office and go to a coffee shop or a different part of the office even. That's a different space where I can have natural light, look out the window, and just be able to be in a spot that gets me mentally where I can focus and really, really drive home the writing. And I'm sure that's going to be different for everyone, like what's possible and what that setting is. But I encourage you all to kind of think back about where in your life you've been sort of most productive and feel like you're the most creative, and think about what those settings are and what were the characteristics of those settings, and then try to recreate that for your writing environment. And then once you're in that setting, you've set aside a chunk of time, you've eliminated distractions, you just need to sit down and pull the trigger on the writing. And people talk about writer's block, and I think that's largely a function of either not knowing what to say, but hopefully we've eliminated that through the brainstorming, research, outlining process. So we know what we want to get across, but there's also kind of the indecision of, well, what word do I use? How do I structure the sentence? And you can kind of go round and round and spin on that. But the best piece of advice I got was from a reporter who was a sports journalist, and he covered the college basketball team. And those games would get over at 9 o'clock, 9:30, and then you have to have his story filed by, I think, 11:30 at night to meet the deadline for the next day's paper. And he said, you can hem and haw forever, but at some point you got to trust yourself and just pull the trigger and go. And so as writers, we got to be willing to do that and trust ourselves and go. All right, the final step of the writing process is probably the easiest to overlook, and that's the editing process. And before I get into that, it's important to realize that as editors, our brain can kind of play tricks on us. So when we edit our own stuff, our eyes and our brains can play tricks on us. And so we need to kind of figure out, how do we overcome those? How do we recognize those biases and get through those? So, to kind of illustrate some of the tricks that our brains can play on us, I found this quote that says, according to a research study at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. So you can see how easily I was able to read that, and just kind of a window into how the brain works. Another one is, after reading the sentence, you are now aware that the human brain often does not inform you that the word "the" has been repeated every time. Again, my brain is going faster and my eyes are going faster than I'm really processing, and I'm kind of assuming things and skipping steps. Now, thankfully, tools like Word has embedded tools and things like Grammarly catch and underline things like repeated words like this for us. But still, the point is that if we're trying to edit something, especially something that we wrote, there are certain biases that our brains have, and our brains are wired a certain way that sort of get in the way of catching some of these mistakes. So as editing, we want to really, ideally you could find a friend or find a colleague or someone who you can share your piece with, who can be the objective set of eyes and someone who's detached from it to take a fresh look at it. And the editing process is the easiest to skip because in some ways it's the most painful. You've spent all this energy creating something and you want to be done. And the last thing you want is to hear someone say that it's not good enough or something about it doesn't work or doesn't make sense. But editing will always make your piece 10%, at least 10% better at a minimum. And so resist that phrase, the urge to kind of say good enough is good enough, and try to take it to the next level by finding someone who can give you feedback. And even if they're not a trained editor, ask them sort of like, what do you take away from this? Ask them questions of what you want them to think about it and see how they respond. But if you can't find someone to edit your piece, or maybe your schedule doesn't allow for it, maybe like, hey, you got to write an email to your boss and it has to go out in the next 20 minutes. To edit your own stuff, it's important to, let's say you've just composed an email and you spent 20 minutes typing it out, you thought about it, and now you're ready to hit send. Before you hit send, I recommend sort of getting up from your desk, get away from your computer, take a walk around the block or a walk around the floor in your office, just to kind of reset your mind and reset your eyes. So then come back to it and look at it with a kind of a fresh point of view. And you're looking for mistakes, making sure, hey, does everything need to be in here? What can I take out? Does it all sort of flow together right? And finally, for really important stuff, if you can read it out loud, that's a great way to catch things, again, that your eyes might not catch. So again, editing, it's kind of the most painful part because you want to be done. You don't want to get bad feedback, but you've put all this work in the previous 4 steps. This is a chance to make things even more impactful. All right, so when we think about the writing process, on the left we have what I say kind of the wrong ways to think about writing is just kind of one big thing that we do. It's amorphous and we're doing it all at once. The correct way is to divide up those steps into 5 discrete parts of the process. Allow yourself to focus on each one of those things one at a time and go through that process and trust that process. And this is the process that we use and that works for us. But some people may want to switch the order of like research and brainstorming, for example. That's fine. Or some things that may feel like an outline isn't essential. I understand that. But the important thing is to develop a process that works for you. Find out, sort of do a post-mortem on things like, hey, how did it feel? How did I do as a writer? How painful was this process? How efficient was I? Did it land right? And think about what works and what doesn't work and develop a process that works for you and stick to that process, because having this process is what takes a lot of the pressures off. It allows you to kind of like, again, focus on the steps rather than becoming overly focused on the outcome, which is what leads to writer's block. All right, so that's our first main step, is kind of trusting the process. And now these last 5 are more, less about the process and more sort of finite little tips that we can get into to kind of make our writing more interesting and more impactful. As investment writers, the writing about investments is challenging because there's not a whole lot new under the sun. We're all sort of talking about the same concepts and we're all using the same jargon, the same terminology. And it's hard to kind of have something new and interesting. And we're also writing about sort of abstract ideas that are not tangible often. They're sort of hard to understand and relate to. So what we want to think about is, how can we be storytellers as investors? How do we take our investment thesis and create a story around it? And when I think about this, I think about The Wizard of Oz. I also think about The Wizard of Oz a lot because I have 2 young daughters, so Wicked is big at our house. We hear those songs a lot, so Wizard of Oz is top of mind. But going back to the book, The Wizard of Oz, it was written in the late 1800s by Frank Baum, and it's not a story really about Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Lion and the Scarecrow. It's really an allegory about the political debates of the time, and largely about populism and monetary policy, and should we change the way the dollar is backed by the gold standard to increase inflation, to relieve debt on farmers, etc. So the author was trying to make a statement about monetary policy at the time, and I think he was smart enough to realize that, hey, if I write a book about monetary policy, that's not going to land well with the masses, or that's not a very interesting way to convey the story. So he created this sort of fantasy where all the characters represent different politicians at the time. The yellow brick road represents the gold standard and the mistaken idea that if we follow the yellow brick road, it'll get us where we want to go. And interestingly, the author in the book says it's not gold that will get you where you want to go, but it's gold and silver. So when to get home, Dorothy needs to click her silver slippers. As you can see in the picture, and as we remember from the movie, they changed the slippers from silver to ruby because it would show up better on the screen. So just know that in the book, it's silver slippers, not ruby slippers, and that's a way to sort of increase the money supply by backing it by silver in addition to gold. But aside from the color of her slippers, the main point is that that's an idea, that's an example of someone taking a very abstract, complicated idea and applying tangible, visual, interesting things to create a different way to bring it to life. So as you think about the story that you're trying to tell, I don't think you need to incorporate flying monkeys or witches on broomsticks into your next quarterly commentary to your investors. But I do encourage you to look for ways to kind of bring that idea to life. First off, analogies are good. Again, investing is very abstract and non-tangible. So if you can find ways to take these ideas and compare them to something that's relatable and interesting, that's a great way to connect dots for your readers. Secondly is kind of the show don't tell principle, meaning that it's one thing to talk about something in the abstract, but if you can find examples and if you can kind of take big ideas that are abstract and make them small and tangible and real, that's much easier for the human brain to remember and to process than staying in the abstraction. You also want to think about kind of creating conflict and then resolving that conflict. This is essentially what storytelling is. Like all stories have a conflict and a resolution, and you want to do this as a writer. And so you want to think about the conflict is what the reader thinks right now, or maybe a misconception they can have, or they're not doing the thing you want them to do. That's the conflict. And then you want to whatever you're writing needs to resolve that and create some tension between that and resolve that tension for what you think the path is going forward. And then finally, like I mentioned, as investors, we're all sort of talking about the same things, using the same terms, which is inherently not very interesting. Now that it's hard to find a new topic or a new idea in the investment world. So because of that, I encourage people and I encourage our clients to do this is if you don't have anything differentiated to say, find a different way to say it. So rather than, I think of the impulse a lot of times in our industry is to everyone reverts to the exact same terms of art and the same jargon. But if you really want to get someone's attention, take an idea and go out of your way to use distinct or different words to explain that, and don't fight the impulse to try to like, here is how an investor would say it, but instead think about something original and something a new and interesting way to convey that concept. Again, if you don't have anything differentiated to say, find a different way to say it. All right, getting on to our third tip, and this one is probably my favorite one to talk about because it's the one I see the most, and it's probably the most damaging to anyone's piece of writing. And again, this comes back to my training in journalism school. And one of the first things they teach you is to not bury the lead. And the lead in journalism's article or story is the kind of the main point and the most important thing to take away from it. And we're taught to put that front and center. But often when I'm reviewing things from clients or from kind of non-trained writers, let's say they send me a 5-page paper to read about credit spreads again. And often it seems like I won't get to the main point until like halfway through page 3. You'll see the main point sort of hidden in the middle of a paragraph. And as a reader, if I have to work hard to understand what is the main point and what's the most interesting, impactful thing, then the writer hasn't done his or her job. And again, burying the lead is something that happens all the time in writing. And the good news is it's the easiest thing to fix. And you fix it by realizing, okay, what is the main point of this? I want to put it in the headline. I want to put it in the subhead. I want to put it in the first paragraph. So you just hammer it over people over the head with your main point, tell them the main point, remind them the main point, and tell them the main point again. Again, do not make the reader work hard to figure out what is the main point of this, and don't bury it in the middle of your piece. And a good way to think about this is comparing how a lawyer writes versus how a journalist writes. So if you've ever read a legal brief, you know that lawyers are taught to write fact, 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 and then conclusion. So they lay out, here's the facts of the case, here's relevant case law, here's kind of procedurally what's been happening, here's all the facts, and because of all those things, here's the conclusion of what we want the court to rule. Conversely, a journalist inverts that. A journalist writes the conclusion at the beginning and then fact, fact, fact after that. I believe that the journalistic way is the much more interesting and reader-friendly way to write because hey, we don't have our readers' attention for as long as we think they do. And we can't trust that they're going to get through the whole thing and get to our conclusion at the end. So again, we want to start with a conclusion, start with the lead, make it very prominent, and then the rest of the piece can kind of validate and explain why that makes sense. So again, write like a journalist, not a lawyer. All right. Number four, our fourth tip is overcoming the curse of knowledge. Steven Pinker, who's a professor at Harvard, says that the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing. So what does he mean by this? And what is the curse of knowledge? The curse of knowledge relates to the phenomenon of once I learn something, it's impossible for my brain to unlearn it. Meaning that once I've done the research, once I've kind of throughout my career learned something, I inherently, it's embedded in how I view the world and how I think, and it's impossible for me to kind of separate from what I already know. You can't unring the bell as the person with the knowledge. The reason this is a problem as a writer is that the people you're writing to, by definition, don't know all the things that you know. Or if they did know all the things they know that you know, you wouldn't need to write the piece in the first place. So what we have to do as writers is to be very cognizant of the fact that I know way more about this than anyone who's reading it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing it. And so I need to stop myself from assuming things that are sort of intuitive, or things that may seem intuitive or very fundamental to me aren't to the reader. And so I have to stop myself from sort of, as a writer, I have to spell things out more. I have to think about, what does the reader not know? I have to be very empathetic to the writer and put myself in their shoes and imagine and work very hard to figure out, what do they know? What do they not know? And this is where, in the brainstorming and research process, talking to people and kind of floating ideas by them and seeing how they react and what raises eyebrows, what gets challenging questions, that sort of thing, is a great way to sort of get outside yourself and overcome that curse of knowledge. All right, number five, attacking the misconceptions. This is another one of my favorite tips, in that when we're writing about a topic, it's easy to assume that our job is just to show how smart we are by explaining everything there is to know about this topic, or whether it's an asset class or a transaction or a investment strategy. It's tempting to think like, okay, my job is to share all the relevant details about this. But if you do that, you're sort of missing the point that the reason you're writing isn't just to share knowledge, but it's to get someone to think, act, or do something different or feel differently. And so we got to think about, what is the lens, or how do we frame this information in a way that's relevant to them? And I think one of the best ways to do that as a writer is to start by figuring out, okay, what are the misconceptions about this topic that I'm writing about? And I'm going to focus my argument around the things that people either, maybe they have half the story, or maybe they believe something that's not true. And by going there and kind of framing my argument around that, I'm overcoming the curse of knowledge, and I'm meeting the reader where they're at. And I'm doing it in a very empathetic way. I'm starting my piece by saying, hey, you may believe this, you've been taught this, but what you know only gets half of the story, or what you know is in fact incorrect. And here we're going to tell you kind of a better way to think about this. Here's the rest of the story. Here's the more interesting part. So again, as writers, if we can think about part of our brainstorming process is, okay, what are the myths about this topic and what are the facts? And I want to live in that space where there's tension between those things, because that gives me sort of a reason to enter into the argument and advance the conversation. All right, final tip is to narrow the scope of what you're going to cover. I like to show this slide, which is the ocean, and I tell people, don't try to boil it. Besides, after burying the lead, I would say that trying to boil the ocean or being too broad or too exhaustive is probably the second biggest mistake I see from a lot of the things I see written by investment professionals. And I think, and it makes sense, because as a technical person, your inclination is to think, okay, I'm writing for other people who know as much about this as I do. And if I don't include everything, they're going to notice that I didn't include something, or this fact is important, so it needs to be in there. But the thing you got to realize is that the broader you make your piece, the harder it is to be interesting. And if we're not interesting, they're not going to read it. If they don't read it, what's the point anyway? So it's better to narrow the scope of what you're going to talk about and give yourself room to go deep and be interesting, as opposed to try to be broad and exhaustive. And again, this is especially true with more sort of technically minded people. Like there's this impulse to like think, well, more facts and more details are always better. Or if we kind of talk about every part of the process, that's better. But really, you need to realize that you only have your audience's attention for a short amount of time. So the more that you kind of dilute that by, or dilute your messaging by including more things, the more risk you run that they're going to focus on the wrong thing and they won't focus on the thing that matters the most. So again, I think kind of don't bury the lead and narrow your scope are two of the pieces of advice I give the most to our clients and people on our team. All right, so let's go through all of our 6 tips, or I guess I'll go through those real quickly again. So have a process and trust it. Think about elements of storytelling to incorporate into your writing. Try to be interesting. Try to make it come to life. Don't bury the lead. We talked about writing like a journalist instead of a lawyer. Start with the conclusion and then provide your facts after that. Overcome the curse of knowledge by putting yourself in the shoes of the reader and getting outside yourself and think about what do they know, what do they understand. And then attacking the misconceptions. That's a great place to figure out, okay, what's the angle for the story? What am I going to say that's going to advance this conversation? And then finally narrow the scope. So I'd like to close and kind of open it up to questions now. And I know we have lots of time and love to hear sort of your thoughts or your reactions to some of the things we talked through. So I'll open it up for people to submit their questions via the chat. But as people are thinking to do that, I'd like to think about what do you view as sort of for yourself, what are the biggest roadblocks to becoming a better writer? And how do you view, like, what do you feel is getting in the way for yourself of how do you kind of elevate your writing? So I'll give people a couple minutes to send in their questions and see if any good ones come in.
All right, Scott, thanks for that. The chat's open and there are a couple questions in there. If you want to view those, 2 just came in. Chris asked about your process for utilizing subject matter experts versus writing from the expert's viewpoint. And then there's a second question about topics that'll attract the most readers from your experience. Probably need to cater that answer towards, the person asking the question's background, but maybe talk about SMEs first.
Sure. Yeah, Chris, I see your question. Thank you, Connor. So what's your process for utilizing, hold on one second. Process for utilizing subject matter experts versus writing from the expert's viewpoint. Columnist versus journalist might be an apt comparison. Yeah, that's kind of a function of what your job is. And, but for us, a lot of times as ghostwriters, we're never the expert. I mean, our job is just to interview the portfolio manager or the analyst or the banker, whoever it is, and convey their point of view. But there's nothing wrong with being the expert yourself, but that means you have to be sort of credentialized to do it. So, the columnist point of view is like if what you're writing about aligns with what you think about, you want to kind of explain, here's why I'm qualified, or here's how I have the bona fides to have a point of view on this. But even if you are sort of like yourself is sort of the main expert in the piece, it's still valuable to talk to other people and bring in points of view that kind of corroborate or add a different perspective on what you're writing. And so I think that just kind of gives you a chance to test your ideas with others and see what they have to say. So I would always, even if it's sort of like you're the PM and you're just writing your quarterly commentary, don't sit in an ivory tower and kind of think all the ideas in your own head, but test those out with other people, interview folks or kind of show your ideas to them and see what their point of view is and see if that can kind of stress test and enhance what you have to say. Good question, Chris. Thank you. I see one question here from Ryan. I know Connor's, I think it's from Ryan. Can you speak to the role AI is playing in your work and how you're integrating it without being replaced by it? That's a good question. I'll turn off the screen here. So the AI thing, I knew that would come up and I'm glad it did. So AI, I think the best way to think about it as a writer is that it's helpful. Right now, I feel like it's more helpful on the input part of the process than on the output part of the process. What I mean by that is, if you go back to our writing steps, AI can be, or steps of the writing process, AI can be very useful in all of those. Whether it's brainstorming, research. I mean, obviously it's hard to even research without using AI anymore. Like Google like forces you to use the AI results as opposed to. And we found it's very helpful in the writing for like the headlines are hard to write. It's hard to be creative and you can't get stuck in a rut. So we think kind of brainstorming headline ideas or it's even though some of the stuff may not be all that creative, it's a way to kind of get out of your own head and get out of the rut of the line of thinking that you're viewing on that. It's also helpful for sort of putting something in and trying to dial up or down the level of sophistication. Like you can put in a draft and say, hey, how do you make this more for institutional audience? Or conversely, how do you take something and make it more for a retail audience? And so, you know, when it comes to drafting or creating first drafts of things, the types of pieces that it's good for are ones where there's already a consensus point of view of what the right answer is. So an example I'll use is like, let's say a wealth management team wants to write a piece about, should I convert my traditional IRA to a Roth IRA? You know, there's already 1,000 articles out there that lay out, here's the 5 things you should think about, and here's the trade-offs. Like, and so the world already knows what the answer to that is. And so AI can go in and predict what a piece like that should be and do a very good job. And it's a good start. What it wouldn't do, though, is it wouldn't sort of understand, okay, for your practice or for your clients, what are the questions that typically come up, or what's the angle you want to take on it, and things like tone. But for something like that, it's generally pretty good, and it does it sort of instantly and for free. So it is replacing us for stuff like that. And frankly, it probably should, because you know you're not really advancing the conversation there. There's not a whole lot new you could say about the Roth IRA conversion story. But that's also a limitation of AI in that it's bad when it comes to thought leadership. By definition, AI is bad at that, because AI is just sort of predicting, trying to guess at what people would be expected to say about this topic, which is kind of the opposite of advancing the conversation. And so I found that it's impressive at how good it can get to, how quickly it can get to B- work on things where topics are well known. But when it comes to areas like, hey, we have to really show our expertise, we have to show that we know more than other people, we have to advance the conversation. AI just inherently doesn't do that, because that's not what it's trained to do, at least yet. But again, like as you think about each of those 5 steps of the writing process, AI is certainly helpful as an input in each of those 5 things. And even like the editing, the words spell check is a form of AI essentially, or I mean, it's kind of a primitive form of that's been around forever. And so the spell check just gets better and better. And it's not just spell check, but that now like tools like Grammarly can flag sentences that aren't concise enough or suggest different types of sentence construction. So very helpful in that. And so, you know, useful at every step of the phase, but it's not, you know, given the type of writing that you do, it's more or less of a threat to replace that.
Great,
and
thank
even
you.
like, yeah, and even in like the investment writing world, like we worked on a project with a client recently, creating commentaries for their ETFs, and they're like kind of 4-page pieces, and within that, there's certainly parts of it that AI should be writing, like when you're kind of writing the attribution part and the sort of what were the big changes in the portfolio, et cetera. Like there's no reason a human should be writing that over and over again, because it's just pulling information. But when you get to the parts where like, okay, this is where we need to say, like, here's what we were thinking, here's the nuance of what's happening, that's again where AI can't do that. And so I think it's not this binary thing of like, oh, AI can create this or AI can't. It's more like, what are the parts of a piece that AI should do, or what the human should be doing versus what the machine should be doing, and discerning those things on the front end.
Yeah, to your point, it was like the input, right? It's like collating data research. So let the computer do that, and then do your own perspective and your own thoughts. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. All right. Here's one from Oriana. As someone who writes about investments but doesn't actually have duties related to them in marketing, what are some tactics or questions we can ask the experts to help develop the content? Yeah, that's a good question, because I am not a CFA myself. I've never managed a portfolio. I'm not an analyst, but we spend our life interviewing those folks. So which can be a little daunting, because you're sort of going into their turf, and they're talking at a level where they're the expert. And so one thing I like to start, again, getting to that misconceptions, is you don't want to waste the SME's time by having them kind of give you the basics. So that's, it's on me before that call to read everything they've written and Google everything I can find and what other asset managers have written about that topic to get my sea legs. And so then it's, I love to create a list of questions ahead of the interview that really get to the parts that I think are going to be the most interesting. And I ask them to, and I always have that misconceptions question in there. And I like to start with that by saying, okay, there's a lot written about this topic. Here's kind of the consensus view. Where does the consensus get wrong? And by framing it that way, it gives the SME a chance to kind of dive into the parts that they view as the most interesting or where they can really advance that conversation. So again, create that list of questions ahead of time and really focus on do your research, read what the consensus is, and then ask the SME where the consensus is wrong or where they disagree with the consensus. All right, question from Danelle. How to write for an audience with a wide range of expertise, i.e. ranging from knowing little about the subject to knowing a lot. So in the asset management world, this kind of is sort of a shorthand way of talking about what channel are we writing for? Are we writing for the institutional channel or are we writing for the retail channel? And even within the retail channel, there's a difference generally between, an ultra high net worth family and the retail investor, the non-accredited retail investor. And so a question we get from clients a lot is, should we create multiple versions of it or just kind of create one version that aims for the middle? And generally speaking, you want to think about, so what's the commercial goal of the piece you're writing? And that'll guide you sort of like what the level of sophistication makes the most sense. So certainly like not all of those audiences are going to be equally valuable from a commercial perspective for what you're writing. And so think about, okay, which group do we care about the most? If I can only create one version, I'm going to write a version for the segment of the audience that matters the most. And that's going to be my North Star. But if you can create multiple versions, that's kind of a helpful way to segment and think about, okay, what does each group know and what do they care about and where do they get hung up on? But again, I would say be very commercial minded, meaning that we're not writing for the sake of writing. We're not writing just to show how smart we are. We're writing because we want people to do things, and those things invest in our fund or hire us as their consultant or hire us as their advisor, or whatever it is. There's a reason that we want people to do things. There's a commercial reason for that, and kind of work backwards from there and figure out which segment matters the most commercially and write for them. All right, Chris wrote, in sell-side research, they teach you to have 3 bullet points to frame your research report. Do you agree with this approach? And what are the positives and negatives of this approach? All right, Chris, I have seen a lot of those sell-side research reports, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's not just limited to equity research. I think it's kind of become a commonly held best practice of, when you have a long piece, it starts with kind of the 3 key takeaways at the top. And so I'm a big advocate for it because it, again, getting back to my point about not burying the lead, it sort of forces you to identify, here are the things we really care about that we want the reader to really understand. We're going to make those visually prominent right at the beginning. So big fan of the 3 takeaways, even though, everyone's doing it. There's a reason that everyone's doing it and it makes sense to do. So I like doing that. I don't really see any negatives to it. I know some people may think like, oh, well, I want them to have to I don't want to give them the answer before. I want them to sort of understand the buildup or the logic to it before giving them the answer. Or they may think, oh, well, if they just read the key takeaways, they won't read the rest of it. But the reality is that the only way you're going to get someone to read the whole thing is if you draw them in at the beginning. And that's why you want to make your key takeaways very interesting and compelling and provocative. Because if your writing wasn't interesting, they wouldn't read the whole thing anyway. So again, big advocate of the 3 key takeaways, and I would write those last after you write the whole piece. Like you want to, when you're creating the outline, you understand what those things are, but then write the piece and then think about, okay, given all that I've said, how do I distill those into the most interesting, provocative ways for the reader? All right. Can you provide an example or 2 of writers you enjoy and think they do a better than average job conveying the message? Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, so from a firm perspective, Capital Group, their Capital Ideas is, I think, kind of the gold standard in the industry. And so it's not one particular writer. But I think Capital Group, from like a corporate perspective, their writing is generally viewed as the gold standard in asset management of writing, and they do a good job of being very sort of intentional about being interesting. So in terms of individual writers, I like, who's the guy who writes Deal Book for the New York Times? Is it Sorkin? Is that his name? I think he's pretty good. I think they're pretty interesting. And I'm a big fan of George Will, the columnist for the Washington Post, or he's written for other publications, but I like him because he's sort of it's a fundamental exercise, because I have to look up probably about 10 words every column that he writes to find out what the meaning of it is. So I kind of like the mental exercise of a writer who sort of is intentionally trying to make me smarter, make me think a different way. So there's my tips. All right. I see we're getting close to the end of time here. Maybe time for one or two more questions. All right. Can you give me a topic that typically attracts the most readers from experience? Oh, well, that's tough. I mean, it's really a function of kind of what industry you're in or what kind of where we're at. But I would say, as sort of a general rule, topics that it's more like, how do you write the headline to make it interesting? And you want to make it clear, the headline needs to make it clear what you're going to get out of it and how this advances the conversation. So those, you want to be provocative, and you want to think about, okay, how can I challenge people? And so the more that you can be timely, the better. And the more that you can tie what you're writing about into what's happening now. Timeliness always helps sell. And I would think another principle is fear of missing out, or FOMO, is a very powerful thing. And so if you can frame your piece around, here's what others are doing, that if you don't do this, there's a problem, or you're missing out on something. That's a good way to frame things. All right. I think I'll wrap it up there and just say that appreciate all the questions, very thoughtful stuff. We think about this all the time. It's always interesting to see the questions from people who aren't sort of writing for a living and doing it every day. And this, as you know, the session's being recorded, and I will send out the recording. We also have an ebook that we'll send out to everyone, which is a version of the slides, but it's really kind of the slides with the script along with it. So it'll kind of follows the same narrative arc as the slideshow, but the slides are kind of have captions and tell you, here's the main points for each slide. So I know the CFA Society of Minnesota will send those out shortly. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate all the interesting questions and feedback. And with that, I'll hand it back to Shannon.
Yes, thank you so much, Scott. There's a lot of great information. And as Scott mentioned, we will get you the recording and the ebook as soon as it's available. And I did want to also mention, if you're interested in more personal and professional development, next week we're having an in-person event called Managing Me, Creating Effective Relationships with People and Money. So some of the skills will be effective relationships with people and money, effective self-management, real-time decision making, and learning how to align your thoughts and actions with your emotions, moral compass. And these are invaluable skills for achieving success. As a thank you for attending today, we will be offering a 50% off discount code. Megan put it in the chat, and we will also send that code out with the recording and the ebook. And again, thank you all for your time. And thank you, Scott and Connor, for connecting with us and bringing this to our society.
Thank you.